Oh my God, I'm so tired. Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and today we're making 6 portable walls with grass on one side and wainscoting on the other with a barn board catch bin. Check it out. Okay, so this was a big project and it started off with a lot of material. Basically setting up just to break down sheet goods. I basically do the same thing every time I have a sheet good project like this. I start with one of these centipede saw horses and some rigid foam, and I'm working right out of the back of my truck. So I started off here screwing 3 of the pieces together, marking out my numbers, and grabbing the track saw to start breaking these down. I did a lot of planning before this project, so I know that I have the room in the design to be able to screw these pieces together and gang rip them all at once. You know, you don't always have that capability, but in this case, since they're getting covered in grass and there's a couple other factors, I'm able to rip them sort of in this coarse way. And they actually were all very, very true to their dimensions, so this worked out really well. And I started off with the 3 sheets, and then as I got this first section broken down, the weather wasn't great that day, so I was thinking, you know, I got to get this done. So I started to stack up all the sheets and realized that I could just, you know, kind of bang through the pile and get this done a little more efficiently. So again, I have the pile set up and I just am putting in some screws, and I'm going to run the saw now at the absolute max depth that I can get. And in this case, this saw will cut through like 3.5 to 4 sheets at once. So I'm able to get a scoring line on the backside too. Great, it's raining. This is why you shouldn't work outside. So the main reason that I even did this outside despite the bad weather was because you can see how much dust this produced, and I really don't like to cut OSB inside. The dust is kind of nasty, and anything I can keep outside I will. So I just hunkered down in some rain gear and finished up my cuts, blew everything off with the air compressor, and was able to get all the pieces broken down relatively quickly. The sawhorse definitely makes a huge difference, and being able to cut right through onto the foam is a total time saver. Just kind of cleaning up outside and bringing all my material in so I can start cutting up the rest of the parts. So here you'll see I'm just using a stop block pretty much, and I'm clamping it to my miter saw station. There is no reason to have to measure when you have to cut 12 pieces of wood. Just set up a stop block and cut them all at once. Yeah, so as I said there, I try and use a stop block as much as I possibly can when I'm doing something so repetitive like this. You know, in this case, I'm making 6 of these walls, and it requires a lot of sets of 2 pieces of material, so I wind up with a lot of, you know, basically cuts numbering in 12 or more. So with the nice stop block set up, very positive, I know that I'm not going to move. I'm able to make a lot of these cuts accurately. Okay, so over here, I just cut all my pieces to length at 71 inches, so 6 feet minus 1 inch, because I want the half-inch sides to come in. So now what I want to do is I want to cut half of those pieces of material down to accommodate the thickness of 2 pieces of 2x material to kind of mortise into them. So instead of measuring, I'm just going to use these as a spacer block. I'm going to lock these in here. I'm going to put a clamp right here, and then I'll be able to know that when I cut those pieces down, they're going to accommodate the 2 pieces of 2x on either side. And you'll see that when I go to assemble it, how this plays in. Yeah, so I'm continuing forward with my cuts, and I've got, you know, more big sections of 12 or 6 pieces at a time, just cutting everything up. And there'll be a drawing in the description of this video that'll have some dimensions to what I built and a little detail as to sort of how things lined up and how long each of the internal pieces were. Now I've just moved the stop block to cut some of these smaller pieces as well. And here's an important little blip right there. You can kind of tell two of the different sizes of pieces are very close, so I make sure to mark them very clearly before I start. It's really easy to grab the wrong one and wind up jammed up. So I'm starting my assembly with two pieces of 2x4, and they're going to be screwed together in an L configuration, and then these 2x2s rise up from that, sort of in the pocket that's left, and then another 2x2 straddles across the top, and then I go over to the table saw and take some 2x scraps and I rip those down a little bit so that I can get a sort of internal spacer that's going to run between the 2x2 vertical and the other side. And I put those in. For this entire thing, I'm using 3-inch construction screws. And with all the extra pieces that are going on this, they wind up being super solid. So I'm just throwing some screws in the bottom and into the side over there, and then my last stretcher bar. So you can see how the way they kind of stagger. It's very important to stagger your joints when you're building something like this, because it's really easy to just try and build frames and put them together, but it can really easily like jam you up, and you can wind up in a position where the thing's totally rocky and not stable at all. And here I'm just ripping the sides of the boxes that are going to be covered in the OSB. With this, I am using the table saw inside on the OSB. At this point, it's pouring outside, so there was no way I was getting back out there. And I head back over to the miter saw station, and I set up my stop block again and just make some more cuts of the side panels. Stack these up and just cut them all at once, pretty much. And I'm going to basically build my first one here and just do a test. So I have all the pieces cut, and you'd think you want to just go ahead and start building them, but I always like to do a test assembly of one. Let's make sure everything goes together correctly before I go ahead and use all the rest of the pieces in case something has to be adjusted. And I'm using a collated drywall screw gun here, and if you've watched any of my other videos, I use these a lot when I do panel projects like this. They really speed things up. I highly recommend getting one if you have a shop, if you're on a battery platform, or even a quartered one. They seriously save you so much time when it comes to screwing stuff in. And drywall screws aren't for construction, but in an application like this, they work really, really well. So now that I've got one totally done, I go and I basically just bang through the assembly of the other 5. And here are just some clips of how that went. As you're building stuff like this, when you're doing a batch project like this, the first one, you go to school on the first one, right? Jimmy DeResta always says that. So you go to school on the first one, and then, by the time you're done, you're an expert. Unfortunately, by the time you're done, the project's done. So, but all these things, they tie in, they add to your sort of, your mind's toolbox, right? And, you learn how you can be better on the next project. You learn how you can integrate some of the little tricks that you did on this project on the next one. So, I'm getting these things put together, sort of each one a little bit better than the last, and, moving forward with the plywood and the sides and getting everything really nice and tied up. And these things wound up being super solid when they were totally tied together, even without any glue. They were really, really solid. I was really happy with how rigid they were, especially because they're only 6 inches deep and the material is not that beefy. And just finishing screwing off that last one, and I can move on to the next step. So what I decided to do, since the plywood overhung just a little bit, it was a little irregular, probably because of the gang cuts in the beginning. That's no big deal. I just went outside and I took the trim router with a pattern bit and I just routed off those edges. Obviously, this is the next day. It's not raining anymore. So I routed off those edges and made everything really nice and flush. This little battery powered router from Rigid works really well for that application. I was taking a full pass, 1/2 inch cut, and it definitely, didn't bog down too much. So I did that, and then I took the cordless belt sander and I just eased all the edges. OSB splinters really badly. It leaves these really sharp little shards that get stuck in everything. So it's important to sand the corners anytime you're going to do a project with OSB. So now I'm just bringing them in, and it's time to cut up the grass. Now this faux grass it's really nice. I'll put a link in the description to the company that manufactures it. It's got a really heavy plastic backing. It's made to go on the ground. It's not made for this intended purpose, but the way that their roll was sized, it wound up being totally perfect. These are 7.5 foot wide roll, and I bought about 20 feet of it to do this job. So it's really heavy duty, and I'm going to do the first piece basically as a test, and then I'm going to move through this test and learn from it, and then do the other 5. So right now I'm using wire lath screws to attach the grass to the sides, and I was really worried that the grass was going to fall off, and that was the last thing I wanted. So my thought here was to use wire lath screws to start, and then go back with staples to sort of smooth everything out. I did it on this one. I used a bunch of wire lath screws. I really wasn't happy with the way it puckered in the material, and the staples I wound up using were so strong, I wound up not needing the screws. So in the other ones, I did use a couple of screws just to make sure I had nice anchor points, but I didn't use as many as I used in this first one. I wind up switching over to an 18 gauge narrow crown staple, and I use a 5/8 inch staple, which gets me like a really nice sink in that OSB. And there were a couple times where I made mistakes and tried to pull the faux grass off, and this stuff was on there so good I could not get it off without totally ripping it apart. So that's really good. And now I come back in with that stapler, and it's really important you have to spread the grass away before you put any staples in, because obviously you don't want to leave any flat spots. This stuff was really thick and plush, so it wound up being really easy to just make sure that you didn't pucker any of it down. And now that first one came out nice, I can go and make the cuts for the other 5. And I'm just using a paint marker and a chalk line, and then I'm using this 8-foot level as a straight edge and just cutting it with a regular utility knife. Nothing like some repetition. So now that I've got my 5 other little grass carpets cut, I can move into wrapping them around the boxes. And you'll see my method has already sort of changed. I'm doing them from one side, and I'm making sure that I wrap it around. I'm making sure that everything stays nice and flat and tight, pulling out any sort of ripples that might be in there. And I left like a 1.5 inch overhang on the top, and I wanted that to sort of bridge onto the catch bin that's going to go on top of the planters when they're all done. So I wanted it to overhang a little bit. It kind of cleaned up the look, in my opinion, and I'm happy with how they came out. So doing one side, flipping the units up, doing the other side. Obviously there's a bunch hanging over, which is fine because that all just gets cut off with the razor blade, and it looks nice and clean. And I'm adding a liberal amount of staples because the last thing I want is for these things to go anywhere. These units were built for an event actually in West Virginia, and so they have to be palletized and shipped to West Virginia after I'm done with them, and then they're going to be handled by the company who hired me to build these team. So I want to make sure they're really stout and really durable. The last thing I want is for someone to drop one. If they drop it, I want it to survive. I want it to have some longevity to it. So I want to make sure that I overbuild it just in case of that worst case scenario where something goes wrong. So I got the second one done, and I've sort of developed a rhythm for myself now, and only got 4 more to go. So now that I've got the rest of them all buttoned up, I can start cutting down my material for the catch bins. Now the catch bins are going to be made using this bandsawed pine material, and the term bandsawed pine is coming from Home Depot, where I bought them from. They're basically just a knotty white pine, and you're going to see in a second, they have a really interesting texture on one side, and that forces me to put them through the planer. I only give them one heavy pass. They are pine, and this planer's got a lot of power, so I just run all of them through the planer, and then I continue to process them.
So the reason that I planed that material was because, as you can see here, this bandsawed pine from Home Depot comes with these deep ridges in it. And I don't really understand how those ridges really get in there, because I can't imagine that it's sawed that evenly. I think they might be from like roller grooves that pull the material through a mill. I might be wrong. Leave me a comment, because I've seen bandsawed pine before and it doesn't look this regular. You can see it's extremely regular. So one shot through the planer and now it's nice and smooth, and we can keep moving.
So everything's flat, and now I can start ripping it down on the table saw, just cutting all my pieces once again, to the proper size. This is 6 boxes, so 12 pieces long, and then I wind up having to cut the small side pieces as well. Again, just doing a quick little test fit and measuring to make sure my next piece is going to be correct. I set myself up with a little stop block, but as you'll see, I quickly realized that the steps I'm taking might not be totally correct.
I should stain this before I cut it, so that's what I'm going to do.
So I took all the pieces outside. It was a beautiful day, and I got to staining them all. And there's a little trick that I posted on my Instagram about how I stain these boards. I wanted that sort of reclaimed barn board look, so I got myself some Minwax special walnut stain, and what you do is you don't mix it and you don't shake it at all. You don't stir it up. You let that heavy, deep pigment stain sit at the bottom of the can, and you pour off the top. You are only going to get about a 3/4 volume yield out of the can, because there's a good quarter of heavy pigment in the bottom of the can that you're obviously not going to be able to use. But what it does is it gives you this nice thin washed look, and it really brings out the character in this pine without muddying it up and making it just look like a muddy brown. So I really like to use this method, and you can see these boards came out really nice. They're nice and lively, and you can see a lot of the knots and a lot of the grain still within them, and they don't look washed out. So now I can go back and I can cut those little pieces that I had started cutting before, and those are just going to be the sort of depth pieces for the catch bins on the top. Now these are more or less signage for a trade show booth. So these bins are going to hold small samples and things for consumers to drop by and pick them up. Now, you might be asking why I stain these before I assembled them. It just makes things a lot easier when you can just lay out and stain a bunch of boards. I didn't want to have to try and squeeze a sponge in there and stain them once they were built. Everything looked so much nicer having them stained in advance, and it was so much faster for me to stain it, let it dry, and then put them together. There was a tiny little bit of touch-up I had to do, but again, that was super easy. Just with a Q-tip, you can go and touch up any areas that maybe don't have any stain on them. So I'm just banging these together with some glue and some 1.5-inch brads, and that's more than enough. These are gonna get glued down, and then they get a bottom installed in them, so they're plenty sturdy, even just with the glue and with the nails. So with all those built, I start gluing them down. I just apply some glue to the bottom, flip it over right onto the top of the little wall, and then I'm going to take some brad nails and shoot them down in on a pretty extreme angle to tow this into the 2x material that is the frame. And at this point, I haven't put the bottoms in the little wall boxes yet, and there's a good reason for that. You'll notice that when I move these, I reach my hand in and I grab onto that 2x2. These are super cumbersome to move just by yourself. So having that little place to grab on saved me a ton of energy and made these a lot more manageable in the shop. They were still super heavy, and it was a really exhausting job to do by myself, but every little bit helps when you're building something like this and you have to build so many of them, especially so fast. I only had about a week to do this project based on the approval and then the deadline. So here I'm going in with the stapler again, and I was just stapling the grass to the catch bin just to tighten everything up. And these get a wainscot panel on the other side, so I'm processing the wainscoting here and just ripping everything on the table saw, and then I'll go back and I'll cross cut all the pieces to cover that side nicely. And now cross-cutting wobbly material like this can be a little treacherous. You see I have those little work platforms off to the side. It's better to have a second person when you're cross-cutting really flimsy material, especially like this, wainscoting, but it's nice to do it on the table saw. It's just repetitive and it's easy to set up. You don't have to move the track a million times. The other part of these are the legs, and these are 1/4 inch by 2 inch mild steel, and I had a buddy of mine who works at a steel supplier shear these out for me because I was really pressed for time. So he sheared them, and now I'm just marking the hole locations that I'm going to drill for some screws. And I'm using that little template block just to make sure all the screws wind up in the same place on every one. And now I'm just sizing a drill bit for the screw and heading over to the drill press to drill my holes. I didn't punch these in advance because they're not super critical where these holes are. I just relied on my little Sharpie mark, and I drilled all these out. So 6 units, 2 feet per unit, that's 12 pieces altogether. Now once those are done, I set myself up with a single flute countersink. These are my favorite type to use. I feel they give the cleanest hole. And once I get that set, I plunge it back into the hole, and I set my depth stop on my drill press so that all my countersinks will be exactly the same depth. I just think that that's a much cleaner look. It's really easy to overdo it with a countersink or underdo it and wind up with a little bump. So I banged through those, took them outside, and spray painted them all black. And now the way that I do this is I make sure that I spray paint the bottom of them first, so that when I flip them over to spray paint the tops, if the bottom's still a little wet, it's not a huge deal because you're never going to see it. And then the tops can have more time to dry, and I won't waste any time. So while those are outside drying, I start laying the boxes back down and putting the wainscot paneling on them. Now for these, I'm just making sure everything is nice and square with the top. I'm not that concerned with the bottom. I apply a liberal amount of glue, tighten everything up right to the bottom of that box, which overhangs just a little bit, so those will kind of lock in right to the bottom so you don't see the edge. And I'm using 18 gauge brads again here, and I'm trying to go in between the little beads on the wainscoting so that you don't see them. And I go back with some wood filler and caulk. And now it's time to install the sign. So the signs are an acrylic sign with a aluminum standoff that keeps them off the wall really nicely, but they have to be dead center. So the layout here was really critical. Now, these were pre-painted panels, so I didn't want to leave a bunch of pencil marks on them. So after, kind of measuring things out and leaving a couple of very light pencil marks, I decided to put in some tape in the centers, both vertically and horizontally, and do some measurements to figure out exactly where I needed to be. Once I got everything laid out, I'm able to lay the sign in the middle of the panel, using my registration marks, and then I use what's called a transfer punch, which is a punch with a specific diameter and a hole in the middle with a little point so that you can punch through a hole and get the center of that hole. And now I'm just pre-drilling for the screws that hold the standoffs down to the wainscoting, and these will also help keep everything nice and tight because those are going to hold that wainscoting in. In this case, I took the protective paper off the sign so I could see what it looked like, and I put the standoffs in and just confirmed that everything was nice and square and looked good. With that done, I can add the feet. I decided to go 6 inches in on either side, and I'm using a speed square to make sure that those feet are nice and square. And I'm using some exterior rated epoxy decking screws to hold those in, which just in case there's any water or anything, the screws aren't going to rust out. And the legs are 18 inches wide, and they're really, really sturdy. So now I've got the first one done. I got the sign on, it looks great. And I can add the little trim piece that's gonna go right at the top of that grass and wrap around the catch bin to just tidy up the edge of that wood. And this is just some 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch pine that I ripped on the table saw and I stained to match. You can barely even see it from a distance, but it's a little detail like that that just makes things a little bit cleaner when you're up close. And now I can move on to the next one. This was probably the most labor intensive part of this project. So I have to move every one of these units, which at this point are probably pushing 70 pounds, and pick them up onto the table. I got to tidy up all of the grass that might be sticking over the edges. I have to kind of wrestle with these panels and get them installed. I have to climb onto the table to pin them in, and then I got to do this elaborate layout to make sure that that sign is dead in the center. But, you know, it's these little things, these little details make sure that the product looks really, really good. That's the reason, you know, that's the reason why we do this, right? You didn't get into this. I didn't get into this to make a less than great product and make less than great things. So you have to work for it sometimes, right? So again, with the tape and the layout, making sure everything is perfect. And what I decided to do was just leave things, you know, nice and simple for when these things arrive on site. Because of the nature of these acrylic signs, I was nervous to ship them installed. So basically what I did was I set every single one up and I tried the standoffs with a sign, and then I took all the standoffs off, and which made these a lot easier to flat pack. And then I included with the shipment, when I shipped it to the client, a screwdriver, and they'll be able to just quickly install those screws on the 6 units, and they'll be able to have those signs installed probably in under an hour. And it'll just make sure that the signs don't get broken and that everybody winds up happy in the end. Obviously, a detail like that you want to confirm with your client though. So here I'm just adding the trim around the outside. And here's a little trick when it comes to the trim. I have these little pieces that need to be stained. So I just took my staining pad, left it on the table, and just dipped that into it. And that's how you can really easily stain like small trim pieces on the end grain without having to, you know, go and get all dirty.
3 hours later.
So after I was done banging everything together, it was a ton of work. I was able to finally put in the bottoms, and I decided to make the bottoms out of plywood. I just felt that it would be a little flatter and more stable, so I took some 3/4 inch plywood and I ripped it down to the proper size, and then I stained it with the same stain method that I had used before. Overall, these things came out really, really nice. I was super happy with them, but man, they were a ton of work. But, you know, that's what you got to do sometimes. You got to make 6 huge walls, and you got to do it all by yourself in about a week's time. And I wouldn't do it if I didn't love it, right? All right, that's a wrap for this one. Thanks so much for watching. This was a great project. You know, the company, Amazing Grass, they gave me a lot of artistic freedom on this one. They gave me the concept, let me do my own design and run with it. I'm really happy with how these came out. They're really clean. I think they're going to look great at their particular event. I'm really looking forward to getting them out of my shop though, freeing up some space to do some new projects. If you have any questions about anything I did in this video, please leave me a comment down below. If you want to see more behind the scenes stuff and see what we're working on in the shop, there was a lot of stuff involving this project as I did it. Follow us on Instagram at MakeEverythingShop. If you want to know more about what I'm doing over here, if you want some of these for yourself, drop me a line. All the information will be down below, along with some links to some of the tools and stuff that I use. Thanks again so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you on the next video. All right, thanks. Bye.